It's a packed house. This is terrific on a drizzly Tuesday night. Thank you all for coming. I'm Richard Newport. I chair the programming committee for Cine at the moment. And as usual, I want to thank Dr. Baumgartner, Brigitte in the back, our owner, who will be leaving us soon. A lot of you have heard about the transition and things. I would just encourage everybody here to pick up a membership thing on the way out. Those of us in the 99% who actually have jobs and can do deductions, a membership is terrific this time of year. So anyway, please pick up the paperwork on a membership if you can. I'm just simply going to introduce our speaker for tonight, who's going to introduce the movie. Once a month, we've been having a director series, and a number of people have talked about an individual each month. And Matt Knoller, who is not only a Grady Telecom graduate, but also a film studies major, and was one of the best, nicest students you could ever have in your life. Matt will be introducing it, but he's been on our board as an adjunct member for a couple of years. He's a member of our programming committee, and has been terrific as an advocate for many kinds of cinema. He's also got an incredible faith in Lars von Trier when some of us kind of pulled away and said, I don't know if I ever want to see another movie by Lars. You're really fortunate to watch it. It's great stuff, and it's in part because Matt was such an advocate for it. So I would like you to welcome Matt Knoller, and he will introduce von Trier and this wonderful movie. Thanks.
Great, thank you. This is a fantastic turnout, which puts a lot more pressure on me than I was expecting. I'm in law school now, and I'm in the middle of finals, so forgive me for reading from notes. Anyway, yeah, I'm thrilled to get this opportunity to come up here and talk, and it's also kind of a challenge because I've been given 15, 20 minutes, because I don't want to waste too much of your time, to talk about Lars von Trier, who's really one of the most complicated, kind of divisive, controversial directors working. You either love him or you hate him, or you love parts of him and hate other parts of him, and so 15 minutes isn't nearly enough, and so I'm not going to even attempt to do a sort of full overview of his work or try to examine all the different angles or all the different things people think. Depending on who you ask, he's a genius or a fraud or a truth teller or a misogynist or an asshole or any number of things. And so what I'm going to try to do is to just sort of grasp onto a few of the themes and preoccupations that I think are present in his body of work and that I hope illuminate a little bit and also speak to this film. And so consistent with what I think is one of von Trier's big programs, I disclaim any sort of intellectual authority. These are just my opinions. You're free to disagree. And in full disclosure, I will give my opinion on the man, that he is a major director, a great director, and an asshole. And I propose in this introduction an idealist, which might seem a little odd if you've seen some of his not exactly optimistic films, but I think that what you see in his work is a very serious, kind of self-destructively serious moral vision of the world as the way it ought to be, which is a little bit at odds with his public persona, which is of this prankster who never says anything that you can take seriously. And I think as far as his interviews and press conferences are concerned, that's probably true, but I don't think that plays out in his work. And so I think that if you start early in his career, what you see is, as I said, a director who really feels very strongly about some moral issues, but at the same time recognizes that the way that the world is simply isn't how he might like it to be. And so it's an idealism, but it's a heavy idealism that has some anger and despair over that, and also a heavy skepticism as to the ability of that idealism, or really any sort of arrogant intellectual authority to make a difference or have much to say. So I think if you look from the very beginning, his first film in 1985, which was The Element of Crime, and it was the first of a sort of informal trilogy of movies about Europe, which was that, and then a movie he did called Epidemic and Europa from 1991. And An Element of Crime is about this detective in Europe who is trying to track down a child killer, a serial child killer. And he's using a criminology method that he learned from his sort of blowhard professor, which is a trope that comes up again and again in von Trier's work, that involves having to put yourself in the shoes and the mindset of the criminal. And he does this out of a good faith attempt to track down this killer and solve the crime, and by doing so becomes a child killer himself. And so what you see in this and in Europa, where the sort of self-righteous pacifist in World War II on a train and run by Germans in an attempt to kind of stay neutral between the sides ends up supporting these really horrific Nazi war crimes. And so in these two films, I think you see von Trier struggling to set out a balance between what he sees as these huge moral failings in the world set up against his idealism and his skepticism that any sort of firm moral guidance is kind of doomed to fail or doomed to dissolve into empty platitudes and arrogance. And that works out also in Epidemic, which frankly isn't a very good movie, but it stars von Trier as himself next to his screenwriting partner, Niels something, sorry. That's embarrassing. Yeah, screw it. And they're working on a screenplay for a movie about a doctor who, attempting to solve this sort of terrible medical epidemic, accidentally spreads the epidemic through Europe. And in kind of a mystical twist, in writing this movie, von Trier and his screenwriter partner actually spread the disease themselves into real-world Europe. So what you have again is these sort of idealists trying to solve these problems and instead doing huge amounts of damage. And at the same time, this is the first film where von Trier really starts to work in a kind of self-critical aspect and a self-reflexivity about cinema's power over the world and a belief in that, and also, again, a skepticism as to whether that's always a good thing. And as this starts to come out in his work, he starts to pair this view with sort of really harsh critiques of what I think he sees as the dominant power structure, which is kind of this arrogant, patriarchal, domineering intellectual authority that is actually really ineffectual, or at worst, actively destructive and kind of evil. And so he pairs this view of the male power structure with an increasing focus on female characters who end up sort of martyred or destroyed by the male power structure. And that has led to a lot of criticism as von Trier as a misogynist, because he puts these women through really terrible events to send messages, which is troubling in a way, and so that the criticism of misogyny is a serious one that I think needs to be taken seriously. Even though I ultimately don't think it's really all that well founded. And the focus on women really, well, it starts in 1988. He makes a adaptation of Medea for Danish TV. And so that's the first time you really see him focusing on a story with a female character who's sort of driven to destruction and madness by the impositions placed on her by the male society, and her husband Jason, and the king, and this whole system that puts what the males need and the patriarchal power of the kingdom above the woman and her children, which leads to the insanity and the child murder and all of that. And I think that issue mirrors itself in a lot of his later work, starting with what was kind of his international breakthrough in 1996 with Breaking the Waves, which is about a woman, it's sort of an idealistic, innocent, naive woman in this kind of really small religious community in Scotland. And when her husband is killed, or not killed, paralyzed in a job accident, after that he asks her to go out and start having these increasingly risky, dangerous sexual encounters with other men and come back and report to him and describe them to him. And she does this out of a sense of love and out of a sense of thinking that this is what God would want. And so this increasingly self-destructive behavior that I think a lot of people see as just kind of getting off on her misery, I think is actually seen as imposed by her domineering husband, who wants her to do this for his own entertainment, and by the powerful religious community that has instilled these false ideas about what she needs to do. And then also, I think in Dancer in the Dark in 2000, you see the same thing sort of worked out. You see a woman who's blind, played by Bjork, and she's struggling to work and make ends meet to pay for a surgery so that her son doesn't go blind like she did. And in so doing, she has to work in these really horrible conditions and put up with a lot of abuse, and so she tries to escape from these everyday struggles by imagining herself as the star of sort of an old Hollywood musical. And Von Trier directs these very intentionally artificial, sort of distancing musical numbers as sort of a counterpoint and a commentary on what she's going through. And what she's up against in that movie is a corrupt police officer and the state that has taken it upon itself to impose a death penalty on criminals. And so, again, what I think you see is Von Trier sort of splitting his position on these films. He's splitting himself between the female protagonist, who he has said he deeply identifies with, and I think that's probably true. And they represent, I think, what he sees as what could be the fundamental goodness of people in the world, which is faith, kindness, trust, selflessness, all of that, sort of crushed by the world as it is, as run by these kind of domineering, patriarchal, arrogant, authoritarian power structures. And at the same time, he never lets himself off the hook, I don't think either. He's constantly implicating himself as sort of director, controller within these power structures. So I think in Breaking the Waves, when her husband is really the main villain of the piece, and so what he's doing, I mean, he's having her debase herself, go through these horrible emotional traumas as basically a performance for his own edification. I mean, he's a director. He's Lars von Trier to a certain extent. And also in orchestrating these sort of oppressive, artificial musical numbers in Dancer in the Dark, I think he implicates himself in the same way. And in another film from that time period, The Idiots, focuses on another woman who has run away from home or from her family after the death of her son. And she ends up ending up with this sort of phony, radical wannabe artists who are trying to rebel against the strictures of bourgeois society by acting mentally handicapped in public. And I think The Idiots is interesting, whatever its flaws, because it's the only movie Von Trier made that was part of the Dogma movement that he founded. And what Dogma was, if you don't know, was this sort of collection of filmmakers that he and Thomas Vinterberg and a few others started that was designed putatively to sort of liberate cinema from the phoniness of Hollywood glamour by imposing these kind of crazy restrictions on what the filmmakers could do. Only handheld cameras, no scores, no costumes, no period pieces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things to kind of purposely introduce an element of incompetence into the filmmaking. And so I don't really think it's a coincidence that the only Dogma movie Lars von Trier made is a movie that finds a bunch of wannabe radical artists in bourgeois society by acting like idiots in public. And so again, I think you see a really complicated tension there between what is probably, on one hand, a sort of genuine view of artistic purpose, and on the other hand, kind of a joke or a healthy skepticism about what that can actually accomplish and what their motives maybe were. And I think that also goes to what Dogma really was, which was sort of half genuine manifesto and half publicity stuff. And so I think those are some of the ideas that weave themselves through all of these films, and I think make them a little more complicated than a lot of critics seem to think, or a lot of the people who hate him think. Not that there aren't good reasons to hate him. And I think Melancholia is in line with some of that, and it's part of what I think may be a new sort of, I don't know, informal set of films from Von Trier that I think we might call his depression films, because they were made during a period of severe clinical depression. And the first of those came out a few years ago, Antichrist, which is simultaneously ridiculous and really deeply upsetting. And that's because it really does, I think, sort of capture the mood of a depression. And again, it focuses on a female character played by Charlotte Gainsbourg, who's some sort of art historian, and she's studying the depictions of anti-woman violence in the Middle Ages. So already you have von Trier directly engaging with some of the misogyny claims. And after the accidental death of her son, she sort of turns her grief inward and against herself by sort of adopting and acting on the sort of misogynistic myths that motivated this anti-woman violence. Woman is nature, woman is uncontrollable, evil emotion and sexuality, which is really problematic in some ways, but also kind of interesting, because it's not a film where he's actually arguing for these myths, but he's showing how their placement in how society operates kind of leaves this woman nowhere to go but to turn those myths inward and against the men in her life. And the man in this film is her husband, who's a really slimy, you know that because he's played by Willem Dafoe, psychiatrist who has all these sort of high liberal-minded ideas about society and feminism and all of that, and in the end, all they really mask is just this really toxic condescension. And so he's treating his wife as basically a problem to be solved, rather than as a human being that has to act in a world that imposes all these strictures on her. And so there, I think you have the woman turning against the world by sort of incorporating and acting out what it has imposed on her. And that's something I also think you see in Dogville in 2003, which really incorporates a lot of what von Trier is working for. It's set on a blank soundstage with buildings drawn out in chalk. And it's narrated by a sarcastic third-person narrator, and it's highly theatrical and Brechtian, like sort of a mean-spirited Our Town. And so what you have in that film is a woman running from gangsters who ends up in this town, taken in by the citizens who are motivated by the arguments of the sort of self-professed intellectual of the town, who von Trier sort of pointedly names Tom Edison. And eventually the citizens of the town realize that they can actually get things from this woman that they're supposed to be taken care of, and so they start to take advantage, and eventually it turns to really serious physical and sexual abuse. And so what I think you see is, again, simultaneously a really angry critique of some of the hypocrisy of these putatively civilized neoliberal societies, America in particular, in this film. And at the same time, he's really critical of his own body of work as well. I think that Tom in this movie is pretty much a stand-in for von Trier, because he's putting this woman through all these horrible things by method of what he calls illustration about the evils of the world, which is pretty much what von Trier has done, or what his critics have accused him of doing. And by the end of the film, unlike the doomed heroines of Breaking the Waves or Dancer in the Dark, who are destroyed by these societies, the woman in Dogville rebels and turns violent against the society and ultimately wins and leaves Tom / von Trier for last. So I think what you've seen over the past decade is, and earlier in his work, is a developing self-criticism within his moral vision. And that has probably played itself out somewhat in his depression and recent films. And I don't want to give too much away about Melancholia, because you're about to watch it. But I do think that it evidences some of these things as well. It has a female character who is deeply depressed, and this is really a more direct study of depression, I think, than even Antichrist was. And so, enjoy. And but it's also a sort of metaphysical study about how people deal with mortality and how that plays itself out on people and how they act in the world, and how ultimately a depressed person might be kind of better equipped to deal with something like that. And you also, so you see that, you see, I think, von Trier's position split between two sisters in the movie, Kirsten Dunst's depressed one and Charlotte Gainsbourg's more rational sister. And yet again, you have another sort of arrogant, certain intellectual male who ends up being completely useless. So, I don't know, that's all I got to say. Thanks for coming out, this is fantastic, and I hope you like the movie.